So why do we specialize? Specialization in trade, that's what this whole chapter is about, international trade. International trade exists because there are countries, there are regions that have comparative advantage in the production of certain goods and services and should specialize in those goods and services and then trade with the rest of the world. The difference in the resource endowments, those gifts of Mother Nature, are usually the biggest reason we end up specializing or having comparative advantage in the goods and services that we do. It's just that simple. We know that from the earlier part of the chapter 19 discussion that we have comparative advantage in the production of a lot of crops because we were given this fertile farmland and we really aren't going to do anything else with it but grow. And it makes growing really cost effective for us. It makes the opportunity cost really low. So, but we were just given that resource, just happened to be, right? And if you have a resource, you just happen to have, you're probably going to end up with comparative advantage in the production of goods using those resources and should specialize in those goods. Another thing that happens when we specialize is we end up with economies of scale. And I've talked about this several times. Economies of scale, driving down the average cost per unit. Driving down the average cost per unit. You can do that as you produce more. Economies of scale is about decreasing the cost per unit the more you produce. And if you specialize in something, right, probably the more of it you'll produce. And as you do that, you innovate, you become more efficient, you come up with creative solutions because you're more focused than if you're trying to produce all sorts of different things. Another reason for specialization in trade is that given the resources that you have, you and the goods in which you have, goods and services in which you have comparative advantage, it's possible that the people of your country or the people of your region simply don't have the taste for the good in which you have comparative advantage. Well, that's fine. The people in your region don't need to consume the goods that you have comparative advantage in if you participate in trade. It's still effective. It's still efficient. You can still have comparative advantage even if the people in your region don't demand the goods and services that you're producing. So the differences in the tastes of people in different communities is another reason why we should specialize and then trade with one another. Good examples. So let's see, here in this country, we raise a lot of chickens, a lot of poultry, because we have this farmland, right? That doesn't really have a high opportunity cost. And if we're not growing crops on it, let's throw some chickens on it, right? But the thing with chickens is here in the US, we only eat very specific parts of that chicken. We actually don't have any interest in eating large portions of that chicken. And we like a wing with our beer. We like a boneless, skinless chicken breast. And the rest of the chicken, right? Most of us can do without. Those chicken feet, those chicken organs, chicken heads, all of those chicken parts that you and I simply don't have the taste for do have a market. And it's in other countries, Asian countries specifically. We should raise chickens. We should take the pieces we want. We should freeze the rest and send it overseas, right? Because we have comparative advantage. Algeria, about 99% of the Algerian population is Muslim, which means they don't consume alcohol. Now, Algeria was blessed with a climate similar to Napa Valley, where wine grapes grow like crazy. Well, Algeria has comparative advantage in the production of wine. Should they not produce wine because their people don't drink it? Well, no. God forbid, Algeria, don't stop producing wine, right? Keep producing it. And sell it to the rest of the world. Specialize and trade. So specialization and trade, I mean, there's just there's a lot of good things going for it, okay, in terms of efficiency and resource endowments. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit, okay, and I need to give you a little bit of a refresher on consumer surplus and producer surplus before we switch gears. So if you'll remember, we talked about consumer surplus a little bit, right, and producer surplus. Consumer surplus, my example was you walk into the grocery store to buy a gallon of milk, you have $3, it's on sale for $2. That dollar difference is still in your pocket, that's your consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, it's good for society, creates social welfare, it's good for an economy, because I'm pretty sure I know what you're gonna do with that dollar in your pocket. You're probably gonna spend it on something else. It's gonna create jobs. It's all good stuff, right? And that's gonna be that blue area that you see. It's usually a triangle or triangle-ish, right? Usually has a flat bottom right there at equilibrium or at price, okay, whatever the price is. And then under that top portion of the demand curve that rises above equilibrium. So this whole blue area represents people who were willing to spend more for apples, but only had to pay $1 per pound for apples. Okay, good stuff. Then we have producer surplus. That's going to be this yellow area down here. You can see on that lower portion of the supply curve that rises up to equilibrium that creates the boundary for producer surplus, there were suppliers that were willing to sell us goods for less, but got $1 per pound for those apples. So they were willing to actually sell us apples at a cheaper price, but they didn't have to. They got that equilibrium price or that dollar. So it's essentially producer profits. Okay, that's good stuff too. It creates jobs, hopefully increases in wages and bonuses, and that all gets spent and sort of circulates through the economy. Okay, that's good stuff too. Surplus is surplus. Social welfare is social welfare. It doesn't actually matter where it comes from. We treat consumer and producer surplus equally, okay? So this is just a refresher on consumer surplus because we're going to talk about consumer surplus. All right, so now we're going to get into trade restrictions. This is, I think, can be a little tricky. I'll break it down the best I can. The first thing I'm going to do is I am going to only focus on these top two. These bottom two, I don't think they come up in your homework. They won't come up on your exam. You can forget they're even there, okay? We're going to focus on the two main trade restrictions that we see, and that's going to be tariff and quota, okay? So a tariff is a tax, right? Tariff is a tax, and a quota restricts the quantity that is allowed to be imported. So that's how you remember, right? Tariff is a tax, quota is a quantity. Sorry, I know the glare is bad. There you go. Okay? Who's taxing? Who's reducing the quantity? Well, these are government decisions. Okay, so the government decides. The government of every country does, to some extent, restrict trade. They can use one of these two different approaches or a combination of the two. Here in the US, we get a combination of the two. You and I pay more taxes and go up against more quotas, I think, than we would realize we do. Most goods being imported into the US are going to be subject to one of the two of these, okay? Large portion. So the first graph you're gonna see, which we're gonna spend some time on because it's gonna be confusing to some of you, is a tax that helps us explore the impact or the effects of tariff. Tariff is the tax, remember? Okay, so I have to set you up for this graph because there's a lot of things on this graph that you won't be able to interpret without my interpretation. So the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we are talking about international trade and we are talking about goods that are being imported, we need to think about the world as a global economy. So the world is a global economy. And if we were to sum together all suppliers of that good in the entire world, all supply curves for all suppliers, and the demand of all consumers in the world, we would have an equilibrium, okay? We would have a world supply, and we would have world demand. World supply and world demand, and they would have an equilibrium, right? They would intersect at a point like any other market would. So in this case, we're talking about sugar. So how do we find the world price for sugar? Well, we take all world demand, all world supply, we find the equilibrium, and that will give us, right, the world price, the world's price. That's important because on this particular graph, you'll need to know when we're talking about the effect of a tariff, you'll need to know what the world price is. In this case, our world price is 10 cents. What you are looking at here, this supply and demand curve, this is not a world supply or a world demand curve. This is a US supply and a US demand curve. And we've superimposed that 10-cent world price onto this graph because it's how we do the analysis. So on your homework, on your final, whatever, when we're talking about tariffs and quotas, and you're looking at a graph, you usually have to know what world price is. We're usually going to give it to you, okay? Unless it's more of a general question. So here, if we didn't trade, if we did not trade for sugar, if we were a closed economy, we didn't trade with anybody, the price for sugar in the United States, and I'm just eyeballing it because it's not really indicated, is where this supply and demand curve would intersect. So probably about 25 cents would be the equilibrium price for US sugar with no trade at all, okay? But because we participate in international trade, we usually get a lower price because we know that production in the US is expensive because labor's expensive, okay? So we've superimposed that 10 cents. We've drawn that little horizontal line, okay? Ignore all the rest of it for now. Can you see how much consumer surplus US consumers get because of that world price? It's that huge triangle. The bottom border is that dashed line at 10 cents. And then if we follow the demand curve all the way up, right through the supply curve and keep going, we have this gigantic triangle of consumer surplus for US consumers. US consumers gain from international trade. You and I get more at a lower price than clearly we would otherwise, okay? We're good consumers in this country, good consumers. Okay, so now let's talk about what would happen if the US government imposed a tariff of 5 cents on every pound of sugar that was being imported into the United States, okay? Well, actually, let's go back to our world price for just a minute. If you and I got a world price of 10 cents for sugar and we could import as much as we wanted, you can see that if you sort of trace that dashed line at 10 cents over till you hit the US supply curve, US suppliers would give us 20 million pounds of sugar per month. And then if you kept going until you hit the demand curve, US consumers would demand 70 million pounds of sugar per month. Well, if US suppliers were only going to give us 20 pounds of 10-cent sugar, but we wanted 70, we would import the difference. If there was no restrictions on trade, if we could get as much of that world sugar as we wanted, we would import the difference, or that 50 million pounds of sugar per month, the difference between the 20 and the 70, okay? It's an important detail. Now, if the US government imposes a 5-cent tariff on every pound of sugar, they're imposing it on the importer, whoever's importing this sugar into the United States. There are import companies that actually act as the middleman, if you will, between countries. And they would be charged a 5-cent tax on every pound of sugar that was being imported into the United States. I promise you, they're not going to eat into their profits in order to pay the tax that the US government is asking for. They instead are going to add 5 cents onto your sugar and make you pay for it. So they still get their 10 cents. Because if they don't get their 10 cents, why would they bring any sugar into the US at all? Why wouldn't they sell it to other parts of the world? Because the world price is 10 cents. You can sell your sugar all over the world for 10 cents. Okay? So as a result, it just gets tacked onto the price of goods and passed on to the US consumers. So yes, you understand me correctly. The US government imposes tariffs on imports, which get passed directly on to US consumers. Does the US government know that the tariffs are getting passed on to US consumers? Yes, they do. Okay, so the US government is essentially taxing consumers. Okay, all right, so keep that in mind. So we end up essentially paying 15 cents for this sugar. So if we pay 15 cents for the sugar, we now have consumer surplus that starts at that 15-cent horizontal dashed line and below the demand curve, okay? Which means we lose that entire strip of consumer surplus, which you now see shaded in blue and pink. That is a strip of consumer surplus we will lose because of that tariff, okay? If you and I now have to pay 15 cents for sugar, the supply and the demand look different. US supply and US demand look different. You can see if you follow the 15 cents across, our suppliers, US suppliers, are now willing to supply more because the price is higher, right? They can now charge us 15 cents too. They're not going to charge us 10 cents if they can get 15 cents because all the world sugar's coming in at 15 cents. That's the best price we can get. Well, they're going to sell their sugar at 15 cents too, okay? So they're now willing to supply us more. But if you keep going across to demand, we now demand less because we demand less at higher prices. We already know that, okay? So now the difference between supply and demand is 30 million pounds of sugar, not 50, right? So that just closed. Is that limiting the number of goods that are being imported? Well, yeah, in a somewhat natural way, because supply is going to go up, demand's going to come down, and now we're only going to want to import 30 million pounds of sugar per month. So you and I lost that consumer surplus. Let's talk about who it belongs to now. Each of those areas are lettered for a reason. It's because that consumer surplus turned into other things or into nothing at all. So any guesses on who gets the consumer surplus that used to be the area of consumer surplus? That's area A. Any guesses? That's going to be US producer surplus. That's producer profits for US firms. That's the US supply curve that sits on the right side border of that area. And that's not a coincidence, right? That's US suppliers now get a higher price and get to supply us a higher quantity. So area A went from being consumer surplus, US consumer surplus, to US producer surplus. It's important for you to put the US in front of producer surplus. You'll see here in a minute. Any thought about who gets area C? Area C is 5 cents times the amount of the import. Who gets 5 cents times the amount of the import? Not the importers. I mean, yes, we pay it to the importers, but who really gets it? Who ends up with it in the end? Who's charging that 5 cents? The US government. Thanks, Dennis. The US government. So area C is going to be US government tax revenue. Okay, so let's talk about US producer surplus and US government tax revenue. Are those bad things? Yeah, they're not. They're fine, right? So consumer surplus turned into some producer surplus, that's all right, it's a good thing. US government revenues, again, that's a good thing. The problem with a tariff, from an economic perspective, it's what's going on in area B and D. B and D are a net welfare loss. They've evaporated. They're gone. They belong to no one. It used to be consumer surplus. All of that used to be consumer surplus. So we turned consumer surplus into some other things. Yeah, okay, they're still good things. B and D turned into nothing. So the big problem with a tariff is not actually that you and I lose consumer surplus from an economic perspective, right? Because we're looking at the whole picture. From your perspective, yeah, maybe, right? But the problem is B and D, or that net welfare loss. This is reminiscent, or should be reminiscent, of the chapters or the chapter on monopolies, where we talked about that deadweight loss of monopoly. This is the same concept. It's essentially a deadweight loss. It used to be something for someone, a good something for someone, and now it's nothing. It's the problem, okay? You will have questions like this on your homework, and you will see graphs like this on your final. I would come back to this slide for your homework, and I would make sure that I had this little graph available for the final exam. I would say when I focus on trade restriction graphs for the final exam, I'm gonna focus on tariffs. So I'd have this available with some nice notes, understanding what all the different shaded areas are, understanding the implications, where world prices, where US market equilibrium is. I'd understand all these little bits and pieces, how to figure out how much you would import before a trade restriction or without a trade restriction, and then how you would import with the trade restriction, just understanding all the ins and outs of that graph. I'd know it. Okay, let's go on to the quota graphs. The quota graphs are a little uglier, but I don't want you to get too wrapped up in it. You will have to do something on your homework. Your exam, I guess I'm really not sure if I can't remember if I put this graph in or not. Either way, it's open book, open note, have it available. Okay, so let's talk about the effect of a quota. A quota is a restriction on the quantity, a restriction on quantity. So instead of the US government trying to restrict trade by imposing a tariff which they know is going to shrink the quantity imported, they just shrink the quantity imported and give you a number and say this is all that's coming in. and then see how the market responds to that, okay? So this is us watching the market respond to that announcement by the US government. They can't all the goods you and I want can't come in. They just physically can't. So we start out with the same basic information. We start out with a US supply curve and a US demand curve, right? Those two brown lines that intersect at about 25 cents. We have a world price of 10 cents. So we've started out with all the same things. Without trade restriction, we would import between 20 and 70 million pounds per month or 50 million pounds per month. That was the same as it was under tariff. But the impact on the market's a little different with the same net result. So let's say that the quota is 30 million pounds per month. Well, wait a minute. That's what we ended up with under tariff, right? So this is the same thing, just happening a different way. It's just the government deciding they're going to use a different approach. We'll talk about why they might pick one over the other here in a minute. But so let's look at the red supply curve that starts horizontal and then begins to head upward sloping. Let's focus on that because that's the weird thing that's going on here. So initially, right, you and I would take all of the 10-cent sugar available on the US economy from US producers. Then we would continue on, so we're at 30 million now. Now we'll continue on importing the 30 million that are included in the quota, and then the supply curve would just stop. That's all the 10-cent sugar you and I get. Well, here's the problem. If we stopped at that point, that red dot, it would never intersect the demand curve. Well, we got to close that gap somehow. If we're going to close that gap, the only one that can do that, the only party that can give us more supply in order to close that gap are US suppliers, because we can't import any more. So do you see that initial supply curve, that brown supply curve? Do you see how it's just sort of shifted over to the point and then begins to take off again? I know it's weird. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time thinking about this as much as you just need to understand how to get the answers I'm looking for, or understand the information I need you to be able to derive from this, okay? It picks up and finally meets the demand curve up there at point E, which is at a price of 15 cents. You and I aren't going to get any 10-cent sugar, just like we didn't under the tariff. We don't get any world price goods if a trade restriction is imposed. The whole point of a trade restriction is that we get less than we want, and we typically end up paying a higher price for it. US consumers lose consumer surplus either way. Any trade restriction is a loss in consumer surplus on US consumers. It's US government imposed decrease in US consumer surplus, okay? Now we lose the same strip of consumer surplus. It's exactly the same. You can see it even has virtually those same areas, because we ended up at 15 cents, right? A slightly different way under tariff, but we still ended up at the same place, paying 15 cents for sugar. There's a little bit of a difference here in who gets our consumer surplus. So B and D are the same. B and D are the same. That's a net welfare loss for us. Nobody gets that. Used to be consumer surplus, now it's nothing. Area A is actually the same as it was under tariff. US firms get 15 cents. It's bordered by the US supply curve, the initial US supply curve. That area A is US producer surplus. It's that area C in the middle that no longer belongs to the US government because it's not a tax, right? So it's not tax revenue because the quota is not a tax. If we go back to Dennis's first answer, the importers, that's actually who gets Area C under this scenario. It's foreign producers, because everybody's going to get 15 cents for their sugar, even the importers. Well, wait a minute. They don't have a tax, so why are they upcharging us for that world sugar? Because they can. Because you and I are going to pay 15 cents for sugar, because that's what happened in the market. The market, after it did its thing, determined that you and I are going to pay 15 cents for sugar. And so they get 15 cents too. Don't you think they want to be the ones importing into the US because they get 15 cents, where any other country around the world that doesn't have a trade restriction, they're going to sell to for 10 cents? Well, that's weird. We don't care about consumer surplus, US consumer surplus turning into US producer surplus. I told you that's fine. Surplus is surplus. Social welfare is social welfare. That Area C is kind of a problem for me. Why would, and there is a semi-legitimate reason, right? Why would the US government turn your consumer surplus into foreign producer profits? Why? So foreign producers stay happy. Yep. So foreign governments stay happy too. So they'll trade more with us. All of this is good stuff. It's highly political. It's highly political. Because remember, the US government has taken that, all of that world sugar that we wanted, that was available to us, and reduced the quantity. And now the US government gets to decide which countries, which governments actually are the ones that get to sell us that overpriced sugar. It seems like a political barter to me. We'll let you sell overpriced sugar to the American people if XYZ. If we get to import overpriced whatever to your country, if we enter into some sort of trade agreement where we only trade with each other, who knows, right? We get your first batch of good X when it becomes available. It's a highly political. So when I say it's semi-legitimate, it's probably legitimate. Just from an economic perspective, it doesn't initially make sense. There's probably some good stuff that comes with it. It's hard for me to know exactly what comes with it. Okay, any questions on this? Don't overthink it. Just know how much US consumers would want if there was no trade restriction. Know how much we get after the trade restriction. Understand who gets our consumer surplus, and understand what the biggest problem with that is that going to be that net welfare loss. Okay, it's you trading your consumer surplus for nothing. All right, so this is just a summary. This is just a comparison of those two different approaches to trade restriction. There are more similarities than differences, right? Similarities, US consumers get a higher price and a lower quantity because we demand less at that higher price. There's a loss of US consumer surplus. There's a gain of US producer surplus, and that welfare loss, those two little triangles. That's the similarities between the two. The difference is who gets Area C, right? The US government gets Area C of our consumer surplus under tariff, and your author calls foreign producers or foreign governments the quota rights owner. That's his terminology. It's not bad terminology, it's just different, right? The US government grants the right to those imports to certain governments, certain economies. And so it's whoever owns the right to import the quota. The US government decides who they are. You and I don't decide. Okay, the hard part's over. Okay, that was it. It's really those graphs and being able to read them and interpret them. They are a bulk of your homework. Your homework is no joke. Please don't wait to get started on it. Please get it done ASAP in case you have any issues. Okay, we're going to talk about trade agreements next. I'm not really going to talk about this slide. There's nothing from here that'll end up on your exam. It might on your homework, but I'm going to bypass it just for the sake of time. Common markets are a form of trade agreement. So markets, places where goods flow freely. The one I'm going to focus on, the most important one to us, is going to be that last one, NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. Trump redid this a little bit. I don't know that there's anything super significant in the changes, but the name, we, the Americans, US government, changed the name of NAFTA. NAFTA was put in place, I believe, in the 90s. We changed it to the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It goes by that now, or people call it NAFTA 2.0 or whatever. Of course, we renamed it to put the US first, the USMCA. NAFTA is probably, or the USMCA is probably our most significant trade agreement, and especially since I broke the news that Mexico is now our #1 trade partner, really for the first time. I don't think this is going to become less important of a trade agreement. We share borders. We run the gamut of climate and resources. Really, from the northern parts of Canada down to the southern parts of Mexico, we've covered a lot of ground physically and from a resource perspective. So it only makes sense that we would have a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico to keep goods flowing freely, to try and decrease the amount of tariffs and quotas between the US and those two countries, to try and increase the ease of flow between the countries in terms of bureaucracy and red tape and logistics, like making sure that there are customs, not only, well, yeah, most of those goods are going to be trucked. So making sure that the customs at those borders is efficient and allows for those goods to run easily between these three countries. It's probably our most important trade agreement. Not probably, it is our most important trade agreement. And here's the interesting thing, Mexico, and I've taught in Mexico a little bit, and so this was just research or facts that I happened upon. Mexico has more trade agreements than any other country in the world. So Mexico has more trade agreements with more countries than anybody else. And so Mexico lets us take advantage of that too, right? So lots of good stuff. Okay, so you can probably tell by the tone of my voice or how I've explained things that trade restrictions are not popular from an economic perspective. We say, let people trade. We all end up with more of everything at lower prices if we just open up trade, free trade for everyone globally. What I'm going to give you over the next 2 slides are the arguments for trade restriction. Why maybe trade restriction is a good idea. Now, I can tell you that of these 5 arguments, there's really only one argument that stands up from an economic perspective. But I'm going to go through all of them because you will hear people, you might hear people use any or all of these to argue for trade restrictions, why they're a good thing. The only one the field of economics really likes is this first one, the national defense argument. The national defense argument says that even if the US loses comparative advantage in the production of military supplies, medical supplies, food, we probably shouldn't outsource the production of all that stuff because it makes us vulnerable, right? We don't want to outsource all of our military production or our food production or our medical supplies. That makes no sense, right? From a national defense perspective, even someone in the field of economics can say, yeah, that one kind of makes sense, right? That sounds, yeah. Well, let's keep some of that stuff for ourselves, okay? Even if we don't have comparative advantage. These other four, are kind of crap from an economic perspective, but we do hear about them from time to time. These next two, so infant industry argument, this is basically an argument that says if there's an industry that's trying to emerge here in the US that we haven't had before, let's protect that industry by imposing really tight trade restrictions so that that industry can take foothold. We can give them some time to start experiencing economies of scale before we open them up to have to compete with the world market. Well, that doesn't make sense. Let them compete with the world market. If they make it, they make it. If they don't, they don't, right? It doesn't make sense. Anti-dumping is a decent argument, but there are so many laws against it now that we really don't see it happen anymore. But dumping was a practice of taking a lot of cheaply produced goods from other countries and just dumping them on the world, like overproduced goods. This happened one time, I believe back in the 90s, where China produced too many yo-yos and sold them for like a penny a piece or something to some US import company, came in, dumped millions of extra yo-yos on the US market. I don't even know what that looks like, but essentially drove US yo-yo producers out of business. We only have one today, Dunkin' Yo-Yo. If you want a $100 yo-yo, you know where to go. But that's yo-yos, we were going to lose comparative advantage anyway. Those would already be gone. But you can see how if that happened in a market for something important, how it would drive all of the US producers out of business, but then we'd want them back at some point and they'd be gone. So, but there's a lot of laws to keep that from happening. The jobs and income argument, this is the political one that we hear a lot about trade restrictions, about restricting trade with China, restricting trade with anybody, is if we restrict trade, it protects jobs and incomes here in the United States. Okay, yeah, it does, at a very, very high cost. So if we do this, we protect jobs for a very small segment of the population and we make everybody else pay for it through higher prices and less consumer surplus. I don't know. Do we want to protect very small groups of people who have lost comparative advantage in production and all pay the cost for it? The cost is greater than the benefit. I don't know if that makes sense, right? If we lose comparative advantage, we lose comparative advantage. And in a good, healthy, growing economy, we should be able to get people retrained and place them in jobs, higher value functions in an industry in which we do have comparative advantage. Second, and the same goes for this last one, declining industry. This has similar argument. Declining industry argument is an argument that we use when, somebody uses when we've lost comparative advantage in an industry in which we used to. And instead of being like, all right, let's tear off the Band-Aid, let's shut this operation down, let's get these people retrained, we try and put trade restrictions in place so that that industry can slowly dissolve. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Not from an economic perspective. Let's make it happen. Let's move on. Let's get these people retrained. Let's quit playing around. You know, if we don't have comparative advantage, we don't have comparative advantage. Done, right? It's happened a million times in this country. We have lost comparative advantage in the production of a lot of goods, but we've gained comparative advantage in the production of a lot of goods and services as well. All right, I know we only have a minute. So what are some additional problems? We already talked about some problems with trade restrictions or trade protection. Those are kind of synonymous. There are some additional problems. A, when you put a trade restriction in place, it's usually for a certain resource or a certain good that actually may be a component or a resource that goes into the production of a final good. If you're protecting one and not protecting the other, you're creating a problem for that final production or final producer, because they're having to absorb all of these high costs, which make them less competitive on a global market. Lobbying, rent seeking, that's the kind of thing that industries participate in order to get trade restrictions put in place in their favor. We know that's a waste of resources, rent seeking, lobbying. And we would rather you take that and be more, that money, those resources, and be more productive than just ask for favors. From an economic perspective, it doesn't make any sense. Obviously, there's a lot of time and energy that is involved when trying to make sure that industries are adhering to trade restriction policies, to make sure that importers aren't importing more goods than they should, that they're paying taxes on the tariffs when they should. And when you protect industries, you don't force them to be innovative and efficient. You sort of pad them against that. And we love innovation and efficiency in the field of economics, in the field of business in general, right? All right, friends, that's all I have. I want to thank all of you who show up every morning.